Hi, how's it going? It's finally time for part 2 with the DP200. Well, it has been time, but I finally got a tank of 9010 gas and time to get back out in the garage to do some welding. I still haven't received a firmware update. Apparently they were releasing an update to a few people around the time of my first video, but they had issues, so they stopped and started working on a new version. They have supposedly started to roll out that new update recently to a few people for beta testing. I suppose I could have requested to be part of the beta, but there's no guarantee they'd have given me the update early, and at this point I think I'd rather wait to evaluate it until it's finished and released to everyone. It seems silly to show off an update that isn't widely available and may just end up dropped and changed again. With that in mind, this will be a shorter video. I will test TIG, and I will see if pulse welding on steel is improved with the 9010 gas. But I'll wait to do extensive additional testing until the firmware update is available. Otherwise, I'd just have to do it all again to see if they'd made any significant changes. There isn't a whole lot to say about TIG. It isn't like MIG or even stick, where there can be pretty big differences in arc characteristics and performance. The differences in TIG are usually more subtle. This machine does have a very smooth, quiet arc. And it is a true lift-start TIG, not scratch-start, and it works quite well. It starts clean at a really low amperage, which is always nice, but it's especially good for welding thin material. It can maintain an arc right down to 9 or 10 amps, which is pretty good. Sure, some machines can go as low as 1 or 2 amps, but the need to actually weld that low is pretty rare in my experience. 9 amps is plenty low even for welding razor blades, at least assuming you have some kind of backing to draw heat away. And it can do the full 200 amps of claimed output. This means the DP200 meets its output claims in all processes, which is great. I mean, it kind of feels like what should be the minimum expectation, but still, it's good to see. The foot pedal adjusts the amperage up and down quite smoothly, but there are a couple of issues. First is with the pedal itself. Depending on the exact angle I push down at, it will sometimes catch and bind partway down. At times it almost feels like it bottomed out at that point, and once or twice I thought I was giving it full pedal, but it seemed cold and I realized the pedal just wasn't down all the way, and it was just hanging up. If you push it past that slight catch, it works fine, it just scrapes a bit. If I try, I can push it at just the right angle that it's smooth all the way down and back up. But that almost never happens when the pedal is under the bench and I'm concentrating on the weld. It could just be my particular pedal, and it's not a huge deal once I knew to expect it, but it does make the pedal feel a bit cheap. The other issue seems like maybe a bug or an oversight in the firmware. Foot pedal is set up, but I'm not going to press it. Can still start an arc, and without pressing the pedal, the arc stays and I have to whip out. But once I start the arc, I can use the pedal to vary it. That's all the way off, stays lit, gotta snap out. With the foot pedal connected and the machine showing foot pedal mode, the output is still on all the time. Even without pushing the pedal, I can start an arc. And when welding, once I let the foot pedal all the way up, the arc is still going, and I have to snap out to break the arc. It's really odd that the contact in the pedal doesn't turn the output on and off, which is how I think it should work, and how it has worked on literally every other machine with a foot pedal or even a torch switch that I've ever used. And it isn't an issue with the pedal itself. I can hear the contact click, and I even went so far as to test the wiring and the connector. The switch is opening and closing properly. The pedal is working as it should. The machine just leaves the output on all the time. It's something you could get used to, but it's a bit frustrating to have to snap out of the puddle when I have a foot pedal that should be able to turn the output on and off, and I still have to be careful when setting the torch down because the output is always live. So I really hope they change this in the upcoming firmware update. Also, just be aware that TIG mode is lift start only, so no high frequency start, and you have to use a torch with a valve because there's no built-in gas valve for TIG in this machine. That's all fine, but just know that this isn't a full-featured TIG machine. Still, the foot pedal does let you control the amperage while you weld, and even though you have to snap out, the fact that you can drop to just 9 amps before you do means that you should be able to avoid leaving a crater most of the time. So it's not all bad, I just think they really need to make the pedal turn the output on and off. For pulse on steel, not too surprisingly, 9010 did make a huge difference. It no longer drops out of spray as it pulses, and the spatter is almost completely gone. By its nature, it's a spray process, which means it's a super hot process, so it's not going to be good for thin steel. But it is a hot process, so it's good for thicker metal, and it can leave a nice, smooth bead. Before we get too far into it, I may have mentioned some of this in my first video, but I'm going to touch on a couple things that frustrated me a bit, and some of which I think should be changed in a future update. First, not a big deal, and probably not something they could or would change, just something that annoyed me. The knobs are all also buttons, and they push very easily. So often, while wearing gloves, I'd reach up to the machine to spin a knob to adjust a setting, and it would push in or click while I was spinning it, opening a menu, and then ending up changing settings in there because I was still spinning the knob. And clicking the same knob again doesn't exit that menu, I have to click a different knob. So I often found myself accidentally activating menus and then having to push a different knob to get back out, and then going back to try to adjust my setting. Not a big deal, just a little bit frustrating. And probably more frustrating during a review than it would be during daily use because, I'm just constantly adjusting settings, testing different things. The next thing is, now that I do have 9010 gas to use, it again became clear how limiting some of the settings are. When set for non-pulse, I cannot select 9010 gas as an option. The only way to set the machine for 9010 gas is to select pulse mode, at which time 9010 is the only option. So if I just want to do normal spray arc with my 9010 gas without pulse, I have to try to adjust the synergic settings in the 75-25 mode, and in some instances the maximum allowable adjustment wasn't enough to get quite where I wanted to be. Again, not the end of the world, but for a welder with this many advanced features, it seems silly that it doesn't have an option for full manual mode. So getting back to pulse on steel, some folks asked about pulse use for vertical and overhead MIG. One person was even hoping that pulse mode would be kind of almost like an easy mode for vertical and overhead. I actually did not find that to be the case at all. Actually, kind of the opposite for me. To be clear, I'm not an expert at vertical or overhead MIG, and it's very possible that there is a technique or settings or a combination of both that makes pulse mode the ultimate for vertical and overhead MIG. But in my testing, I actually found standard MIG easier, for what it's worth. Pulse mode worked fine for overhead and downhill, though the standard synergic settings for 3/16 steel were too hot and I got bad undercut. I imagine I could remedy that with settings and technique, and grinding off the mill scale should help with that as well. And while downhill MIG has a reputation for giving less penetration, the pulse mode being a hot spray arc means this probably wouldn't be a problem in most situations. So it's not like you can't do vertical and overhead. But if you do need to run uphill vertical, I couldn't make that work well at all in pulse mode or dual pulse modes. The arc would just slice away the base material and the filler just flowed down into globs. Again, I'm no expert, and I'm sure there are folks who could put my results to shame. But I tried for a while, and I never got uphill results that weren't hot garbage. Conversely, after just a few settings tweaks, I got these uphill results with standard MIG non-pulse. Not amazing or anything, so I'd probably still do some more testing and tweaking of the settings if I needed to do some uphill for a project, but I was getting these results almost immediately with standard MIG. And overhead and downhill also seemed a bit easier with standard MIG, though it wasn't as big of a difference. The biggest benefit for using pulse on overhead or vertical, in addition to the high heat if you need that, would probably be the reduction in spatter. Like a normal spray arc, pulse and dual pulse have pretty low spatter, though the dual pulse mode may have a slightly more than the standard pulse. Also, downhill has a bit more spatter than overhead because the puddle is sort of trying to fall into the arc, so it spatters a bit more. Still, it is a bit less if that matters to you. I plan to see if simply running a standard non-pulse spray arc would give similar results on overhead and downhill, but that was when I ran into the issue where I wished there was simply a full manual mode because I was struggling to get the right settings within the limitations of the synergic mode in this machine. There's still more I plan to do with this welder. I want to test flux core, including dual shield, though this welder does not have a synergic option for that, so we'll see how that goes. And other things like thinner wire on steel, thinner wire on aluminum, etc. However, since the upcoming update could change the tuning of pretty much anything and everything, I think I'll wait until the firmware update is available. So the summary for today is that 9010 gas does clean the pulse mode right up. It runs smooth and about as close to spatter-free as MIG gets. I'm sure there will be some use cases for pulse, but for the average hobbyist, I don't think pulse is worth it, at least for steel. If nothing else, consider the challenge and expense of getting 9010 gas. Some folks may have better access to it than I do, but I went to 3 places before I found it in anything under a 300 cubic foot tank. As someone who welds in their small residential garage, a 200-pound tank that's as tall as I am just isn't very practical. Or cheap. Even the 100 cubic foot tank I got, which was the smallest option I could find, was nearly $400. If I wasn't reviewing welders that required 9010, there's no way I would have bought this tank just to run pulse MIG on personal projects. I would have found some other way to do what I needed to do. But maybe pulse MIG on steel is exactly what you need, and if so, this machine runs smooth with 9010 gas. The TIG arc is smooth, it starts and runs as low as 9 amps, and the pedal adjusts the amperage nice and smooth. I just hope they can change the pedal behavior in a firmware update so that it actually turns the output on and off. So, hopefully that was helpful. There will definitely be more to come with this welder, as well as a review of another pulse MIG welder, hopefully sooner than later. I have the welder, just have to get the time. In the meantime, if you have any questions, let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. Take care.